My name is John C. McComb. Middle initial C stands for Critchlow. I was born in Gary, Indiana, of all places, to a wonderful couple, Julia and Harold McComb. And I spent my first 13 years in Gary, Indiana, and then my father, who was a budding steel executive with US Steel, was transferred to Pittsburgh area. And I finished my schooling there, and it was in Leedsdale, Pennsylvania, where we were living, that I had my introduction to the service, the armed services in World War II. It was fascinating to grow up as, well, I'd say fascinating and a little bit frightening to grow up at a time when the world was beginning to open up into probably the most terrible war in history, with, I think, 60 million people killed. And as I think I remember, I was born on September 3rd, 1925, and I remember one birthday, September 3rd, I think it was 1938, when the German troops moved into Poland and World War II broke out. So that from that point in my life, it was kind of the background, living a very wonderful life. I'd like to compare it to the statement that Charles Dickens wrote when he wrote Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And it was both of those things. But at the beginning age when I got into the Army, I served in the US Army for about 2 years, beginning with my 18th birthday and extending through just about 2 years evenly. It began for me when I was living in Leedsdale, Pennsylvania, I mentioned. My father was an executive at the US Steel American Bridge Company Works in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, which was nearby. It's the largest structural steel plant in the world, I think, at the time. And as the war broke out, the US Navy created a Navy shipyard to build landing ships for tanks right next to the American Bridge Company plant. And my father became the assistant manager of that shipyard, so that as I was graduating from high school, that was beginning to build, and the Navy was moving in, and they were creating these landing ships for tanks. High school and junior high school, as the war began, were very wonderful where I was. That's what I said was the best of times. I was in a small high school that was rated high and nationally as in its scholastic ability, so that I had this wonderful time of learning and being in the high school band and doing drama and getting scholarship prizes and so forth. I was a good student. And as this war unfolded, one became very aware of it. They gave us tests to see, they gave us an opportunity when we got out of high school to move into the services and to be able to use our natural abilities. And the test I took qualified me for going to college, they called it the Army Specialized Training Program. So that when I graduated from this, it's a wonderful high school, where it employed, virtually every talent I could have. I was editor of the high school newspaper. I was in the band. I was in the track team for a while, but it wasn't a big enough school that they couldn't support a track team, so my athleticism went lacking. But anyway, in the spring of 1943, I graduated from Leedsdale High School. And then I worked through the summer in the shipyard where they were building these landing ships for tanks until my 18th birthday in September. And in the process, I went and I tried to enlist in the U.S. Air Force, but my eyes weren't quite good enough. And so I went and tried to enlist in the Air Force, and when I flunked the physical, I moved right over to the Army so I could I was eligible for the Army Specialized Training Program and finished the physical there, and they arranged for me to be inducted into the Army on my 18th birthday. So in late September of 1943, I entered the Armed Services of the United States. And they sent me down to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic training. And the whole unit that was being trained were young men like myself that were going into the Army Specialized Training Program. In other words, when we finished the basic training of, I've forgotten how many weeks, then we were assigned to a college in my case, study engineering. And we had a wonderful time. There were an unusual group of men, I think, because I can remember as we were completing our training, we did a lampoon performance for the cadre that trained us to tease them about the whole training process. We put on a program, and everybody enjoyed that. Then we were assigned to universities, and when they posted them on the bulletin board where each of us were to go, I discovered that I was assigned to the Carnegie Institute of Technology in Pittsburgh, right next to my hometown. Wonderful, and I thank God for that, because whoever assigned me had a good heart. And so essentially, then I went back to Pittsburgh. And that reminds me of a story. When I originally went into the Army, my parents took me for my first overnight train ride. They both drove me to downtown Pittsburgh to the railroad station, and I got on a sleeper car to go to Baltimore, and then from then I reported there, and they sent me down to Fort Benning. And when I got on the train and arranged to occupy my sleeper berth, it was an overnight trip, I was sharing the lower berth with a gentleman in marine uniform, and he said his name was John Bassalone. And John Bassalone was a charming gentleman who had just been awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Imagine going into the service and taking a train and sharing an upper berth above a national hero who on Guadalcanal had been in the thick of the fighting and had been awarded the Congressional Medal. And he kind of treated me like a younger brother and welcomed me into the service. And I still have a pang of remembrance when I drive from Los Angeles down to San Diego and go the freeway goes through Camp Pendleton, and one of the first exits is Basilone Road. That was kind of an interesting beginning, because this whole experience, this horrible experience of being in the infantry, which is where I ended up in World War II, was an incredible growth experience. It was wonderful and it was terrible. When I was assigned to Carnegie Tech, I started talking about that before I got sidetracked. But I wanted to tell the story about John Basilone. And I arrived in Pittsburgh, and we lived in essentially student housing on Carnegie Tech campus. And for a period of 3 to 4 months, studied engineering, and enough to do one term. And I was very proud of myself. I got A's and B's in engineering, and I thought, I guess I have an aptitude for that. And one of the major happenings in my life was shortly after we were ensconced in our studies, we were assigned to go to the Masonic Temple, and I've forgotten the exact name of it, but in the college area, the Oakland area of the city of Pittsburgh, where the University of Pittsburgh and then called Carnegie Tech, it's now Carnegie Mellon University, but we were assigned to go to the Masonic Temple for a dance. And all of the college students, the Army, specialized training, and any other services that had students in the universities were assigned to go to a dance, and there were something, I believe, about 1,100 or 1,200 young women who were going to be there to dance. It was a dance. And they lined us up, and of course the cadre, we had Army non-coms who were assigned to get us to classes and kind of supervise us as students. And they kidded us about what a terrible duty we were going through, and they marched us over to the Masonic Temple, and we entered, and dance band was playing, and there were all these lovely ladies, young women, and it was like being a kid in a candy factory, looking around as a young man of 18, looking around at all of these lovely young women. And I was having trouble making a choice as to who to ask to dance first, so I kind of wandered around through and over off on one side there were several ping pong tables, and there were some very lovely young ladies playing ping pong, and I think kind of embarrassed at the situation. How do you get acquainted? But one of them, a very, very lovely blonde young woman, smiled at me, so I took that as an opening and went over and got involved playing ping pong with Dorothy Jane Lauer. And this young woman, a few years later, became my wife. So we played ping pong and we talked, and she said that she lived close by enough that I could walk her home, and I did. And there was the business of first kiss. We had an immediate attraction, and arriving at her house a few miles away, and her mother bawling her out for being so long, and it began a romance that lasted for several years. Abruptly, we received notice that the whole Army Specialized Training Program that we were involved in was being dissolved. What had happened was, of course, the impending invasion of Europe, and they didn't need engineering students or engineers in the Army. They needed infantrymen to carry rifles. So they broke up the whole program, the Army Specialized Training Program, and they assigned us to infantry divisions that were being formed and being manned, so that we provided some fresh cannon fodder for that activity. And again, fortunately for me, the unit I was assigned to was the forming 95th Infantry Division in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. In other words, it was 200-300 miles from Pittsburgh, so that I was able, as we were assigned and being trained into the division, we had, of course, had infantry training. And we went through mountain training in West Virginia over a period of a couple of months. I was able to have passes and go back and visit with Dorothy Jane Lauer. And let's say the romance deepened. And after a few months, it was time for us, for the 95th Infantry Division, to go to France, to go to Europe. I don't remember exactly what the timing was, but I believe it was just about the time of the invasion through Omaha Beach, the invasion of France. So that we loaded up on ships, or on ship actually, and we were sent to Boston, an Army camp near Boston, and loaded up onto the USS America, which had been one of the primary luxury liners, had been converted to a troop ship, and it was now the USS West Point. And you can imagine there were a couple thousand men, and the West Point was fast enough we didn't have to go in convoys. So they just took off, and it was fast enough, and the submarines couldn't keep up with it or catch it. And so we went solo all the way to Liverpool, England. And I'll never forget the first, as we pulled up to the dock, and the stevedores were taking the big ropes and hooking. Was hanging up at the bow of the ship as it was being pulled in, and the stevedores were wrapping the ropes, or were detached the ropes. And I remember the first British words I heard were, "Throw me the fucking rope," which proved that that was the universal word of military language in World War II. Anyway, from landing in Liverpool, we were assigned to a camp to wait our turn to be, and when we were to be needed in France on the front lines. There had been the breakthrough, at that time there had been the breakthrough, Patton's tank divisions had pulled through, and Paris had been captured, and they were stalled along the eastern regions of France and Belgium and so forth. And so we were there actually in a camp in southern England, waiting our turn to be shipped over. I did have the opportunity to go to London. I got a pass to go to London and spend a day there, and it was a wonderful experience, including the process of hearing this buzzing noise, and Germans were using buzz bombs at the time, and you'd hear this pop up, it kind of sounded like an outboard motor going across the sky, and then it'd stop, and then everybody ducked, because when it stopped, it would descend and explode. And you wait, and then boom. Anyway, I was in an infantry squad in the 19th Infantry, the 377th Infantry Regiment. I was a rifleman with a what do you call it? With a Garand 30 caliber rifle that would fire 8 shots, and then you'd put a new fresh clip into it and snap it shut. And that we had more training, and eventually, within a month or two, we were loaded onto a British transport to go across the Channel. I believe we were loaded in Southampton, and it took a couple of days to cross the Channel and get into position off Omaha Beach, where the major invasion had busted through. Essentially, they had sunk several hundred ships to form a natural breakwater for the harbor then they used at Omaha, and we came through Omaha Beach and landed and saw where the battle had been. And then we camped in tents above Omaha Beach and waited a week or two while they gave us hedgerow training for how to fight in hedgerows, because they had done that in Normandy. And of course, we didn't run into hedgerows again, but it gave us something to do. And then the entire division was assigned to the Third Army of General George Patton. And we were assigned to move up to the front lines, which at that time were around Metz, France. That's where the tank divisions had been stopped after breaking through and recapturing France. And we were put into what they called 40 and 8 trains of cars that they called 40 and 8, either 40 men or 8 horses. And so that essentially we had, our platoons were about 36 men, so you had a platoon and a couple extra men in a car for 40 horses, and you traveled with hay on the floor, and it was rather crowded. We were on that, it took us 7 days to go this relatively short distance from Normandy to Metz, France, where the front lines were. And just remembering some of the experience of being in that small a car, at night everybody would pile up on the straw on the floor, and you know the body heat kept you warm, but you always had somebody's legs or arms flopping on you. And if you had to go to the bathroom, let's call it, at night, you'd have to get up and try to avoid stepping over people to go to the sliding door, the door, and then you pull the door open a little bit and let fly out the side of the car. And of course, when you did that, everybody who were sleeping would get cranky, and then if you were unfortunate, somebody would get playful, and as you were going back to your little spot to try to lay down again, somebody'd stick their foot in your rear end and give you a push, and then you'd go sprawling over everybody, and they'd be cussing, and it was one of the joys of becoming an infantry private. Anyway, we arrived near Metz, and it was in the dark. the trains pulled over, and it was raining out, and it was dark, and it was kind of foggy and misty, and everybody piled out of our trains with our full packs and our rifles and lined up to march and replace in the front lines outside of Metz, to replace the 5th Infantry Division, to relieve them on line near just outside of Metz, France. Anyway, you can imagine this. It was this rain and this mess and unloading and non-coms yelling at you to get set up and march off. And we then moved up into the hills in this rain, and it was, believe me, there was a lot of mud. So there was a lot of slipping, sliding, and sitting in mud with rifles and helmets askew and so forth. And essentially, we didn't know where we were going or what we were going into. But what they did, they eventually got us up to the front lines, and the 5th Infantry had dug in and dugout system that was across the hills, about 1,000 yards from the German lines. So they were trying to keep us quiet so the Germans wouldn't know this was going on and wouldn't open up with artillery. And the rain was falling, and as we marched in there, everybody was slipping and sliding and flopping in the mud. It was a nightmare, but you know, there's always a little bit of humor in the mess. And I think one of the most wonderful things about the U.S. Army was the ability to laugh in the middle of something like that, and kid each other, and wallow in the mud, you might say. The group, my squad, they split in several dugout units, which were dig out about an 8 by 8 foot hole about 5 feet deep, and then lay logs across the top and pile dirt over that so that it would resist artillery shells. And the front edge of that dugout was open so that the men could stand up, and the men in the dugout could stand up and fire at the enemy if they were attacking. So that so we moved in, and fortunately, I guess we were quiet enough, or the rain made the Germans miserable enough they weren't listening well. But we managed to get in without any serious artillery barrages or anything, although there were occasional shells coming in, something else to get used to. And so we became ensconced in our dugout. As I say, I was with 3 other men, 4 of us in this dugout where we stayed about a month. And this was one of the key moments in my life, that experience. Of course, it was not terrible, but it was messy. You know, there's constant rain, it did not stop raining for 3 weeks. And every once in a while there'd be an artillery barrage come over and the shells would, and then when there eventually were some breaks in the rain, we went out in combat patrols and had contact with the enemy and so forth until finally we were ordered to attack and conquer Metz, France. I started to say, I said in the beginning, this is the worst of times and this was the best of times. And in this mess, one of the most incredible happenings of my life occurred. It was after, as I said, after about 3 weeks of constant, almost in perpetual rain, And the dugout we were in, there were limbs, and we had added limbs, pine boughs, to put our blankets on, so that as the water gathered, we weren't laying in the mud. But it was frustrating. And I remember I had been, in my youth, had been subjected to very little Sunday school, but my parents had sent me to a Presbyterian Sunday school. They weren't churchgoers, but they thought we should learn about church and so on. And so I had the very basics of Christian education or Christian Sunday school training. So after about 3 weeks, I decided I needed to try praying. I needed to see if this business I'd learned about religion, about God, about Jesus, if that was real. And this was a messy place to be. And so after about 3 weeks, I think it was about 2 in.the morning, I was relieved from standing guard, in effect, listening at the front of the dugout, and my trick was over, so I got back into the dugout and laid down, and I think I smoked for 3 years, most while I was in the Army. And I smoked a cigarette and snuffed it out in the mud beside where I was lying. And I was really sincerely needing to let off something, and I prayed to God. I said, God, we've been here for 3 weeks. It's raining steadily. There are hundreds of thousands of us who are out here in this mess. and among other things, we don't need this constant rain and mud and misery. Could you please stop the rain, Lord? Please stop the rain. And I fell asleep on that note. And I don't know how long, it was several hours. I was supposed to be wakened before light again and do another guard duty trick, but I woke up and there was no one else in the dugout with me. It was silent. There was nobody there. So naturally, I crawled to the front of the hole. The last thing I'd done was pray to God to stop the rain. I got to the front of the dugout with nobody else there and stood up, and the sun was shining. And there was, look up in the trees around us, and they were all had drips of water falling from them, but the sun was out. And the men had moved back into the woods from the dugouts to build fires and begin to dry out. And there I was, and it was the first time in my life when I was really certain that there was a God and that you could talk to him and that you could get answers that would affect your life. That was the greatest gift I received from the experience of the god-awful, if you will, experience of being an infantryman in World War II. It went on from there. I was impressed also with the fact that the infantrymen I knew who had the least fear were the ones who were really dedicated to God and Christianity or Christ, because that's the religion of our country, and because that is what we experience and what we know. And that the ones who were most dedicated and fearless were the most dedicated to God. And from that point on, I did a lot of praying. And I was we were on the front lines from that point for 6 months with maybe a few weeks in a rest area. We were in the front lines for a solid 6 months. During that period of time, I was in an infantry company of 180 men, and there were about a dozen of us who did not get wounded or killed, that did not, wounded and have to go back to the hospital. I got some cuts from shrapnel on one leg, which gave me the Purple Heart, which was nice, but basically that was the closest I came to being wounded, is having a cut that had to have a bandage on it for a few days. But throughout the rest of that time on the lines, that was my experience, as I learned to pray about things. And one of the things when you get into infantry combat, it is very personal. And we did a lot of fighting in the forests or woods. And I remember one example was in a forest. I think it was outside of Metz, before we actually got into the city and began house-to-house fighting. And we had been going on pretty long hours for 4 or 5 days. And I remember we started advancing through this forest, and machine gun fire started coming back at us, and rifle fire. And I hit the ground, and I hadn't been getting enough sleep, so that I actually fell asleep under fire. And some of the guys came back, and when we had pushed ahead and scattered the Germans that were shooting at us, somebody came back, thought I was wounded, and came back and shook me and said, "Where are you hit? Where are you hit?" And they woke me up. I'd fallen asleep. And one of those examples, and I also remember that during that fight in the woods, in that particular forest, seeing a number of people a number of our fellows who were killed, and later one of the graves groups who went around and collected the dead were asking, "Do you know where we're looking for these men, and we don't know where to find the bodies. We understand they were killed." And I remembered that spot because I'd fallen asleep in it. And I said I thought I could find them for them. And we did. And that is, it is almost unbelievable that human beings who are intelligent and in most cases loving people can allow themselves to get into a situation where you go and find yourself in a forest or in a town killing each other. I can remember standing there with a rough old character. Yeah, well, he was old to me. He was probably in his 30s, who was a BAR rifleman, or what, BAR man from, I think his name was Otto Pelka. And we were standing in another instance in a forest outside of Metz, and we could hear some voices coming. We were at the base of a hill in the forest, and the rest of the squad hadn't caught up with us. We heard these voices coming down, and I remember Otto says, "Shush," and we hid ourselves, and several German infantrymen didn't know we were there and were walking down, and Otto stepped out of the bushes and killed 3 or 4 men. And why do human beings get into the situation where they can't think enough and love enough to move through something like that and not have to go out? That literally millions, again I repeat, 60 million people killed in that conflagration. Can you imagine that? Anyway, we then moved into, we were then advanced into the city of Metz and captured it and moved beyond into we were the first of Patton's divisions to break across the German border. And we quickly ran into a German town, I've forgotten the name of it, but through which the Siegfried line fortifications ran. That there was this whole series of fortifications along the German border, tank traps and so forth. And we moved into that town and started the business of house-to-house fighting. And I can remember, you have these memories that are stark and they pop through when you begin to think about them. But I can remember our squad moving into one of the German houses, and we started and went through the cellar window and started working our way up into the house. And as we got into the first floor, the Germans counterattacked and came into the first floor. So we, in essence, quickly went back to the cellar and then attacked through that. And I can remember the Germans yelling, Hinderhook, surrender, surrender. They knew there were some American troops around, and we fired back. We didn't surrender. We wiped them out and moved on to the next house. Again, I point out to you, these are grown men with rifles who are killing each other because some old politicians couldn't solve a problem without a war. And of course, the older politicians don't go to war. They send the young people who have nothing to do with it, they send them over and they get killed to prove a political point. Yeah, a power grab, if you will. Anyway, another one of the blessings happened. The best of times, the worst of times. During this whole period, we were about 100 miles from the city of Paris. And of course, Paris had been liberated and it was functioning. And so that once a week, somebody was given a pass. Two men, I think, from our company or regiment were given a pass to Paris. And I won a pass. My name was drawn. And this was while all this house fighting was going on. And I got pulled out, and I know I was scared to death in the Jeep going to where the trucks would pick us up to go to Paris. I can remember that Jeep going through a field, and there was artillery fire coming. And I was scared to death I was going to get killed before I could get to Paris. And we loaded up in a truck, and they drove us 100 miles or so into the city of Paris. All of the lights were on. It was functioning. Of course, the war was close by, but it was functioning like everybody was out in the streets. Nobody was, there was no sign of war. Apparently, obviously, the Allies had control of the air, and there was no danger of air raids at that moment. And I spent 2 days. I was in a laundered Army uniform. They didn't have any fresh uniforms. They had, they gave us a change of uniforms, but they were laundered, kind of scrubby-looking ODs, as they called them, olive drabs. And another fellow from the company who had won this path to Paris, we the first night, late afternoon when we arrived, we took a tour of Paris. I can remember Napoleon's tomb and the Eiffel Tower. It was, imagine. And then in the evening, and we were staying at a nice Paris hotel. And in the evening, we went to a nightclub. What else? Believe it or not, it was called the Yves Cafe. You can imagine coming from the front lines in house-to-house combat, and 8 hours later, sitting in a nightclub with singers and showgirls, believe it or not. And the showgirls' costumes were elaborate, but they wore nothing above the waist. And here are a couple of 18-year-old, fresh out of college or high school, young men sitting there, and I had my first glass of champagne in my life, and we watched these showgirls. It was incredible, and the next day, afterward, I'll tell the story. After it closed, because of the war, obviously, it closed pretty early, the nightclub, but we had the show and we had the champagne. And as we're leaving, we asked somebody, both of us spoke a little high school French, and we asked, où vous allez pour chercher les femmes? In other words, is there a place we can go to look for girls? And what else would you ask about? And they gave us directions, and we were shocked when we arrived because it was a house where they sell women's services. Anyway, I won't go into that anymore. Here I was a virgin soldier. After that, we, as I say, we were the first of Patton's divisions to go into Germany. And it was in that period of time that the Battle of the Bulge began. And the Germans invaded through the northern part of France and Belgium and Holland, and were attempting a breakthrough. And Patton had this incredible move that is historically noted in all history books and all stories of the war. Within a couple of days, he brought armored divisions and infantry divisions up to stop and close off the bulge, in effect. And it was the last great conflict of the war, and before we began pushing all the way into Germany. What happened was that we were pretty well depleted from fighting on the Siegfried Line and in Germany and busting and capturing Metz, so that we were put on a quiet area in central France as they moved these divisions up to conflict in the Bulge. And my particular instance, I think I had been promoted to buck sergeant by that time because all of the non-coms had been wounded or killed off, and I was an 18-year-old, whatever, but because I was a survivor, I became the assistant squad leader. And staff sergeant was a squad leader, assistant squad leader was a buck sergeant. So they promoted me to buck sergeant, made me assistant squad leader. And I loved that because when you've been in combat for a little while, you have a much better chance of survival if you've survived the first few months. And the best place, believe me, in an infantry squad is assistant squad leader, because his job is the squad leader leads the squad, and the assistant squad leader brings up the rear and makes sure nobody everybody keeps up. So I was in the back part of the attack sequence and very happy there. Anyway, I remember we were moved online in central edge of Germany while they were deflating the bulge, and and I remember one instance we were on an outpost. It was near the forest estate of Fritz von Papen, the German foreign minister, as I remember that. And we were in a house, I was on a house with 3 or 4 men in charge of an outpost in case any Germans tried to come through that area. We had not much going on in that area. It was fairly quiet. And I remember we had a radio with a phone to report in that everything was okay, and so in case there was any enemy attacks. And we were in this German house and rifling around to find out what was, for something to do, pulled open a drawer and found a little series of German tiny firecrackers, believe it or not, fireworks. And I just couldn't resist. This is on the front lines. I couldn't resist. I was smoking a cigarette, and I lit the thing to see what would happen if it would fire, and it went brrr, bap, 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 bap. And immediately the radio, "What's going on up there? What's going on up there?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." I said I found a firecracker, and I was tempted. And then you can imagine the language. "You stupid son of blah, blah, blah. What are you trying to, you scared the hell out of us. We thought you had an attack going." Oh, well, and there is this sense, this humor that goes on in situations like that you remember actually more than the horrible stuff. I can remember a group of GIs when we were stopped at a farm for a few hours searching for chickens that they grabbed by the neck and spun around to get rid of the head. Then we'd cook them quickly as we could and have some fresh food instead of field rations. But I can remember sitting in a privy and listening to these guys hunting chickens in the barn, and that another of those memories. Subsequently, we were moved up to Bastogne. After Bastogne had been recaptured and the German forces had been pushed back, just after that, they moved us up to positions just at Bastogne. And one of the duties I had, one of the assignments I got, I don't remember all the details, but we were just a mile or so out of Bastogne at a crossroads. And there was a Jeep there with a .50 caliber machine gun, which was used in case the Germans had any fighter aircraft that tried to attack us there. There was .50 caliber. My duty was to serve a couple hours, 2-3 hours duty on that .50 caliber machine gun in case there were any planes came through. I was to fire the thing at them. And as I say, the bulge had been deflated. The foggy weather that had kept the air support out had lifted, and it was sunny. And there were where I was on the Jeep, there was a crossroads, and there were all of these open fields covered with snow. And there was a graves registration group, Quartermaster Corps, was going out and recovering bodies from the Battle of Bastogne. And they were stacking them maybe 50 yards from where I was with the .50 caliber machine gun. And you can imagine the snow had preserved the bodies. They were, you know, their faces were red and so on. And most of the dead they were bringing out were Germans, and they were stacking them in rows. But there were also a stack of American GIs. And that was my entertainment for my duty on the 50 caliber machine gun. Another best at times. This was certainly one of the worst of times. We went from there. After that, we were switched from Patton's Army to, I believe it was the Ninth Army. My memory is we were then assigned to the First or Second Army, based on the idea that we were part of teams to go behind in trucks, in troop-carrying trucks behind a column of tanks as they advanced into Germany. And around we were assigned to capture the Ruhr area of Germany, the Ruhr pocket as they called it at that time. And we went off sitting in the backs of trucks, you know, a dozen or more infantrymen with rifles, and we rode like that. That particular time, the first column we went out on, about 7 days solid. Not getting the sleep you got was you sit over and fall asleep on your seat, on the seat in the truck. And after 7 days, when you were worn out, then you got to go someplace and sleep. But our particular division, we captured Dortmund in the Ruhr pocket, and we were involved in the two armored columns surrounded the Ruhr and sealed it off, so that it cut off, I don't know how many thousands of German troops that then had to surrender, who were trapped behind that pincer. The strongest memory I have at that point of a combat experience was I can't think of the name of the town, but we pulled in, the tank columns pulled into a town and drew some fire, so they stopped, and the truck stopped, and we all unloaded, and we went ahead with tanks to clear that village. It was maybe a village of 20 houses, small village, but there was an SS unit, a German, you know, I don't know, well, you know, if you remember what the SS was, it was their prime troops and the most dedicated Nazis. And they were resisting in this small town, and we moved up behind tanks into the push them out of the village. And it was that was where I got my cut in the ankle. They started throwing in mortar fire on the tanks, and I remember a friend of mine who was behind the tank next to the one we were following, and he yelled, and we teased him later, he received a pretty big hunk of shrapnel in his behind, and that's where I got a few pieces hit me in the ankle, so I said, "Hey, I'm going to go get bandaged." I left. Some of my friends said, "What, did you chicken out?" I said, the tanks had already pushed through. There wasn't anything more to do. I wasn't going to stand there and hope the mortar barrage would get me. So I went back and got bandaged before I came back up. But that horrible memory continued with, after we had cleared the place out, we then had to go through and make sure they were all gone. And I was, as I say, I was the buck sergeant leading, but the sergeant was out of action, so I was leading the squad. And we were going through to an area of this small town, and I noticed as I was crossing next to a small field area or a garden area, there were about 10 bodies, German bodies laying there, apparently dead. And as my friend Otto with the BAR that I told you about caught up with me before the rest of the squad, I said, look at that, and I'm pointing to all of them, and I said, I wonder if they're dead. So I fired at a couple of them, and they sat up, and they all began to get up, and Otto again used the BAR and I my rifle to make sure they didn't that they didn't get up and get the rifles and fire back at us. And it was one of the most horrible experiences of my life. It took me some let's say, psychological therapy to be able to forgive myself for that one. That's that was the crux of things. That was the last gasp. I can remember riding in those columns of trucks with the tanks, and the Germans who had surrendered, the prisoners, they couldn't handle all the prisoners, so that they were essentially marching to the rear, or marching through our columns to get to a prison camp or to be a holding place for them, with nobody guarding them. And it's like as we drove along, there were hundreds and thousands of these German troops disarmed and marching back. And of course, some of them were obviously leaving when they could, if they lived in the area, and taking off for their homes. The war, in essence, was over, but there were still people being killed, because the American columns had stopped, and the Russians were taking the process of slaughtering Berlin, and we pulled back to let them do that. We find that we closed off the war, our division, or our company closed off the war in a small town that was totally untouched. It was on the edge, I think it was on the edge of the Ruhr Pocket, but it was a small town that was camouflaged and had laboratories and schools and whatever, university there, and it was a lovely little place, and it was fascinating that the German people that were there and they housed us, and and of course for good reason, they treated us better than the French in Paris treated us, because they were obviously scared, and they knew the war was over, and they knew they better get along with us. And it was from there that we were notified, we're sending you back home quickly. We had probably been on the front lines for 6 months, but most of the other divisions, a lot of the other divisions who were combat experienced had not spent that much time on the front lines. Had spent years on the front lines and had much more combat. So they looked at us, the 95th Infantry Division, as one that was battle hardened and yet fresh enough that they could send back to the United States and then send us on to the Pacific to complete the conquest of the Japanese. So they with that in mind, they quickly shipped us out. We were sent to the primary French port opposite England, which is skipping my mind at the moment, and we loaded into the USS General Gordon, a troop ship, but it was the size of an ocean liner. We loaded into the jet quickly it was Le Havre, France. We loaded into the troop ship and set sail for the United States. And this was April or May of 1945. The war, just after the war has ended, and we're going home fast. And life on a troop ship wasn't bad. There was a lot of people crowded into it. You had swinging bunks, or hammocks or bunks. And as we approached the U.S. coast, we landed in Norfolk, Virginia. As we approached the coast, we ran into a hurricane. Talk about going from from what had become just the frying pan into the fire. We ran into a full-bore hurricane. And it was one, and if you were looking at it as the best of times or the worst of times, I really think it was one of the best of times. It was a safe ship, but it was a spectacle. There's huge, essentially big ocean liners is going into these waves, and the front end had come out, and then the wave had passed under, and they'd go down, boom, and the whole ship would shake. And they kept going into the waves, bong. And there was a forward deck house, and I remember we'd gather, and there's a big door that would open that you could go out into the foredeck, and we'd open it, and as the ship would go down into a wave, and a big wave would start to break over the front of the ship, we'd shut the door before all the water could wash in. And another incredible memory, in that particular ship, the General Gordon, one of the primary men's bathroom facilities was right at the forward end of the ship. And while we were in this hurricane, I can remember going to go to the bathroom, and to shave. I needed to shave. I was in this unit, and I was looking in the mirror with the wash bowl here, and behind me was a row of toilet stalls with the door on them. But you had to grab hold, because every once in a while you go out of a huge wave and come down, boom, and the ship would reverberate, and you'd have to watch you didn't cut yourself. But I can remember looking in the mirror, and behind me with this row of toilet stalls, of seeing when the ship went down, seeing a soldier's head come out. He was lifted out off of the pot up into the air with a startled expression. And anyway, landing in Norfolk on the ship, and the seagulls flying over and depositing on us. I got some seagull stuff. They were looking for something to eat, but they were also depositing. And immediately, we were sent home on 30-day leaves. No longer, within a week of landing, I was home on a 30-day leave with the knowledge that we were to report to Camp Shelby, Mississippi after 30 days, where the division would be restocked and sent to Japan. And the experience then of going from that combat situation back home to Pittsburgh, in the nice home we had across the street from Leedsdale High School, which is now quick Quaker Valley High School, where I had gone to school, coming home, see my girlfriend, Dorothy Jane Lauer, and my parents who were, thanking God that I survived, and I was thanking God that I survived. So what I did was to ask, would you invite all my friends and our relatives and everybody, and let's have a gathering, an event, a party, or whatever you will, and I'll tell my story about what happened in Europe once. I don't want to talk about it any more than that. It was not a pleasant subject. So that there were maybe 20 or 30 family and friends that gathered, and I went through everything that had happened to me for that period of about 9 months. That certainly changed my life. And as I say, it was a horrible experience, but everything since then has paled by comparison. There's nothing that has been as bad as that. So by comparison, everything has been wonderful. That was a blessing. It was a blessing. But of course, the story isn't over. Here's in 30 days, get back to Camp Shelby. Well, I was going through the process of, in the process of writing letters to my girl, McComb, Dot Lauer, and her friends called her DJ, Dorothy Jane. We had written to each other about getting married. So that quickly came up, should we be married? And initially I was against that because I said, my chances of survival as an infantryman are not very great. And being one of 12 that was relatively untouched in Europe for 6 months, and to go again to another front, I said, I think it's better to wait until after we know, after that's over. But people being what they are, and my girl Dot was insistent, and into about 2 weeks of the 30 days, we were married at her mother's Methodist Church in East Liberty, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, East Liberty area of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the parlor of the minister, attended by her parents and my parents only. And after the service, after we were married, we went for a week's honeymoon in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, to snatch some beauty out of what looked like another storm ahead. And it was interesting because it was a resort in Ligonier, resort area near Ligonier, Pennsylvania. And there were a lot of people there on their vacation. It was summertime. And here along comes the war in Europe is just ending, and here comes a couple of newlyweds with a young soldier, and also one of my closest friends from the division, who also lived in Pittsburgh, Earl Kirshner and his wife, had not had a honeymoon. They were married before he went, and so they came with us. So these two young couples. And everybody had breakfast and dinner together in the dining rooms, and you would see them all saying, "Oh, aren't they sweet?" And we were good-looking young couples. and I think so, anyway. And one activity, Dot and I decided we'd like to go, there were stables nearby, and rent horses and ride through the hills of the mountains in this beautiful summertime. And we took horses out, and we're riding. Neither of us are much at riding, and Dot was wearing shorts. And and I, of course, was in my uniform. And as we were riding through the beautiful Pennsylvania hillsides or mountainsides, a thunderstorm came up and we got sopping wet. So we were riding back to the stable as fast as we could, and Dot was bouncing on the wet saddle, and it wore through the shorts she was wearing. So we had to ride over to our car, our family car we had taken with us, and she ducked in the car while I took the horses back. The next morning at breakfast, when we went into the dining area, everybody was sitting there, and when we sat down, Dot, as she sat down, said, "Ouch!" because she was sore from bouncing on that saddle. And she is an outspoken, lovely young woman. She stood up and announced to the dining room, "We went horseback riding yesterday." And everybody exploded in laughter. Anyway, after the honeymoon, I traveled to Camp Shelby in Mississippi, near Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And in the process, we were set up and doing the kind of training you do to recondition and to re-equip the division with equipment and with replacements and so on, and that was going on. And meanwhile, my new bride Dot traveled down on a Greyhound bus so that we could get a room together during that 30 days before going off to the Pacific. And it's worth telling the story. Dot was an outspoken and vivacious blonde lady. And as she was riding the Greyhound bus to Hattiesburg, Mississippi to join me, I remember her at the arrival of the bus, and she got off the bus, and the people that got off with her were kind of frowning at her and grumbling. And she was, madder than a hornet, and the people weren't happy with her. I said, "What's going on?" She said, "There was a black lady, an old black lady got on the bus, and I had her standing in the front of the bus. And I got up and gave her my seat, and these people didn't appreciate it, and I told them off." So they weren't happy with her. Anyway, one of my best war stories happened at Camp Shelby. There were a lot of good times. It was a wonderful experience. Dot and I had got a pass and went to New Orleans. Wonderful. And at the time this was going on, the men of the 95th Infantry Division were not pleased at being assigned to go back in combat. We felt, after 6 months on the front lines, we felt we had done our duty. And therefore, there were those in the division who knew something about public relations and publicity, and they began making a fuss through the media that this battle-hardened division was again being sent in harm's way, and it was not right. I remember the national radio announcer or newscaster, I'll think his name in a minute, Gabriel Heater, announcing about the 4th Division and the 95th Division that was being sent back in harm's way after serving valorously and conquering France and going on the spearheads in the Germany, blah, blah, blah. And they had a good PR as a public relations. I became a public PR man. I think I was inspired. They did a campaign which got into the national media and started pressure to get us off of the shipping list. And so the general, the head of the 95th Division was General Harry Twaddle. Twaddle. It's an odd name, but he was a very dignified and major general. He told Cam Shelby called the division formation, the top list. You can imagine 15,000 men. They found an area, a hillside or a depression where you could assemble 15,000 men around a speaker's platform. And they gathered all 15,000 men of the 5th Division. And you can imagine, I think I was probably back 50 yards or so from the stage where the PA system, so the General Twaddle could speak to us. And he drove in a step out, got to the stage, and proceeded to speak to us about patriotism. And that had to go. And we knew it was much better that a battle-hardened veteran, because we were more effective, we'd be less people killed, and so on. And he began this very impassioned speech to quit fussing and be patriotic to the United States and go forward in battle, in effect. And there's a custom, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, but custom in a large troop formation when people didn't like what they were being told was that one man was in the crowd for troop formation would yell 48, and somebody else someplace off in the other direction would yell 49, and somebody else would yell 50, and concert the entire would yell some shit, and that happened. Somebody in our formation of 50,000 men, with the general standing there on the stage, yelled 40, somebody else 49, somebody else 50. I think there were more than one. There were quite a few yelling this. And then there was 15,000 voices said, some shit. And General Twaddle shook his head, turned around, walked down the steps, got into his Jeep, and left. We heard nothing more about it. Within 2 weeks, we were all discharged. And within 2 weeks, the atomic bomb happened. So that it was like our chorus of voices had been met by the end of the war in Japan. And within 3 weeks, I was home again in civilian clothes. And the war was over. I was with my new bride and looking for, and with one of the best of times was that veterans were given a college education, the GI Bill. And I was looking for a university to go to to study and get my degree. The time at Carnegie Tech was in engineering, but it was all the college I had, but I had to decide between being an engineer and being a journalist. In high school, I had also been editor of the high school paper, and I was kind of enamored with the idea of being a journalist. So that but I decided to go to Ohio State University, which was not too far from Pittsburgh, and it was not too far from my wife's mother and family. She didn't want to get too far away. And so we moved. I enrolled at Ohio State and took courses in where I was best. They had psychological courses. Where do you fit best? I looked at journalism and engineering, and I was very clearly lined up with journalism. So under the GI Bill, my parents, of course, could have afforded to send me to college, but it was I had paid my way with my time in the infantry, and I felt enabled, and so I went through the School of Journalism and got my BA in journalism in less than 3 years, and that completed my experience with World War II and the U.S. Army, and I came out of that a graduate and went to work for a newspaper, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, for just about 6 months, and then became a trade magazine editor. I edited a steel processing trade magazine, and then moved into Aluminum Company of America's Public Relations Department, where I spent 25 years. And the close on this for me, again, taking that worst of times and best of times, I had one of the worst experiences of my life, but it introduced me to what I know is the primary basis of human life, and that is that we as a race, as a planet, as a human family are one. That we've got to quit this idiocy of killing one another and learn basically that we're one family and that we need to love one another. And the God that I encountered the first time in a foxhole in France in the rain is the unifying principle. God is love. And the rest of my life has been spent. I spent 25 years in corporate public relations, as I talked, and then a few years beyond that working for another corporation. But basically, at that point, all through that process, I grew spiritually. I became involved in churches, and I involved in talking to people who had an experience like myself of God, a direct experience with God, and how do you get closer to that? And I began, I did a book of interviews of people who had a direct experience of God, and that was an experience unto itself. And I started listening to an inner voice. I'm a mystic. I started listening to an inner voice that told me, you ought to start doing video interviews like this with people who have an experience of God so you can share that with more people. And I had no experience with producing or creating television, but I listened to that inner voice I call the Holy Spirit, and it led me to how to do it. And I talked to hundreds more people of that there is a presence of God. It is a living part of every human being, but it requires you waking up, waking out of the mess that civilization is in, that creates wars and pestilence and so forth, when none of that is necessary if we can open our lives to what we call God and discover who we really are. And believe me, the World War II, in all of its horror, led me into that pasture of wonder. And I would share it with you if I could. If you want to carry this further, I've done some of this on the internet, and there's WWWAllianceforhumanity.com, which is one website, and there's another one that is related to it, a cooperative website that is www.gatheringoftheways.com. And I would leave that with you and say that what I've learned to do is love everyone. And I can base a lot of that in starting out my life in World War II. Thank you.